Thank you very much, Francis, for the warm introduction. Thanks to all of you for coming out this afternoon. It's reassuring for those of us who toil away writing books that we're not doing so in vain, and that people actually occasionally read them, and maybe the ideas trickle down into broader debates about the United States and its role in the world. Just to set the record straight, that day in Boston, it was raining and about 51, 52 degrees, and so I was fine as long as I was running, but then when I stopped running, my body temperature plunged. And Frances just casually treated this event, but I think she may have, I don't know if she saved my life, but she certainly wrapped me up in lots of blankets and plied me with all kinds of drinks, perhaps good ones as well as bad ones. But whatever you did worked, because we're both standing here today. If you took a snapshot of the world in the year, let's say 1700, you would see a world in which power was broadly diffused around the world. Here in North America, there really wasn't much economic or military capability, but across the Atlantic and across the Pacific, there was a great deal. And power was roughly equally distributed across 5 main imperial centers of power: the Holy Roman Empire in Europe, the Ottoman Empire in what is today Turkey, the Mughal Empire, present-day India, the Qing dynasty, contemporary China, and the Tokugawa shogunate in Japan. Each of these spheres had its own way of governing, its own cultural and political approach to commerce and to order. If you fast forward about 100, 120 years to the 19th century, the world had changed dramatically. Power had shifted from the West and the South to the North. And by 1815, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Europe had pulled ahead of the rest of the world. And the Industrial Revolution and the development of the steam engine and the development of steel and battleships and the telegraph and the underwater submarine cable enabled Europe not just to be the most powerful place in the world, but to extend its reach globally. And by the end of the 19th century, Europe had either colonized or had already decolonized 90% of the world's landmass. And we have been living in a world since 1815 dominated by the West, economically, politically, and ideologically. First it was Europe. Then Europe handed over the baton to the United States after Pearl Harbor. Pax Britannica morphed into Pax Americana. And roughly from 1815 until today, Europe, the United States, and I would tuck Japan in there because they've been part of the Western alliance system and the Western liberal democratic capitalist system since 1945. This section of the world has really been at the front of history. And what I'd like to suggest this afternoon, and what I write about in my book, is that the global order is starting to change again. The pendulum is swinging in a way that it hasn't swung since the 1700s. But this next global turn, this new swing of the pendulum, will be different than the last. Why? Because the last time the pendulum swung to the North and the West, and North America and Europe were at the head of history for the next several hundred years. Today, the pendulum is swinging everywhere and therefore nowhere. It's swinging to China, to India, to Brazil, to Turkey. The United States will do just fine in the 21st century, but so will a host of developing countries that have been behind the West for many years. And as a consequence, the 21st century will not be an American century. It will not be a Chinese century, an Asian century, an Indian century. It will be no one's world. It will be a world that for the first time in history will be integrated and globalized, smushed together, to use a technical term, but without the guardianship provided by the Western anchor. So what I'd like to do in the next 15 minutes or so is put some flesh on the bones, tell you why I think we are at the cusp of that historical intersection, and then end by saying a few things about what we as Americans should do about it. That the pendulum is swinging and power diffusing is, in my mind, unstoppable. And I'll just trot out a few facts and figures, and I'm drawing mainly on projections from the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and from Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs likes to do studies of the future. The United States is today by far the most rich country in the world, but the Chinese are fast catching up. By 2027, the Chinese economy is supposed to have an aggregate GDP, global gross domestic product, equal to ours, and it will then pull ahead. By 2025, according to projections, we will live in a three-currency world: the dollar, the Chinese renminbi, and the euro, as long as the euro survives, which is looking somewhat more likely today, but I wouldn't bet a lot of money on it. And in perhaps the most stunning piece of information, we live in a world today in which 4 out of the 5 most wealthy countries are still Western. There is only one country that makes the cut into the top 5, and that is China, and they come in at number 2. In other words, this is still a world dominated by the West. Over the course of the next 3 to 4 decades, that pecking order will be completely changed. Of the top 5 countries in the world, only one Western country will make the cut in the year 2020, 2040, 2045, and that is the United States. And all the other top 5 countries will come from what is today the developing world. That this shift is occurring in the distribution of power is in some ways not that interesting. We know this happens. We know from history that power over time diffuses from the core to the periphery of the international system. I think the more interesting question is, what does it mean for the way the world will work? What does it mean for the order that we Americans and Europeans have collectively built, what's called the liberal international order of the 20th and the 21st century? Here, I think, is the interesting question. And there are 2 main views. I would say the dominant view, well represented in the building at the end of the mall and in the State Department at the other end of the mall, is the view that this shift in the distribution of power will not fundamentally change the world that we live in. Why? Because even though the West will lose its material prominence, its ideological primacy will last. Because the Chinese, the Indians, the Brazilians, the Turks, and others will take their place in our order. They will dock in our harbor. In other words, the Western liberal order of capitalism, liberal democracy, and secular nationalism is about to be universalized. This is what Frank Fukuyama famously called the end of history about 20 years ago. I don't think it's going to be that easy. I think that by 2030, 2040, we will live in a world in which the West, in an ideological sense, finds itself only one of multiple versions of modernity that will have to compete in the marketplace of ideas, with state capitalism in Russia, China, and the Persian Gulf, with political Islam in the Middle East, with a left-wing brand of democratic populism in Latin America, and that our expectation that every country would actually converge and ultimately want to look like us will not prove to be accurate. Let me give you a sense as to why I think we are heading toward diversity rather than toward ideological convergence. In my mind, the rise of the West followed a unique political and social trajectory. We, as Americans, find our roots in the year 1100, when Europe began to fragment, when the three traditional institutions of authority, the monarchy, the nobility, and the Catholic Church, began to lose their stranglehold over society because a nascent bourgeois